the powers that be are digging into that right now and have been for several months. And we are expecting some kind of conclusion to this down at the SEC meetings in Destin. So, Jason, up top, where do you think this is headed? Where do you think it will head? What do you prefer? What do you think makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, I think the 9-game schedule makes the most sense, right? I mean, we talked about this a little bit before we went on camera here, but you get to preserve some rivalries that way, whether they've been long-standing rivalries, excuse me, or whether they've been some rivalries that the SEC's kind of manufactured here over the last few years. And when I say manufactured, I'm talking about maybe like Texas A&M, LSU has been a rivalry that's not necessarily traditionally been one, but it's kind of been created through conference realignment. So yeah, I mean, I think
competitive and competitive too. So
yeah, so I think it makes the most sense for it to go to 9. And I think Mark, you and I have talked about this on several different occasions. I think the one impact of negative impact of conference realignment, and in some cases it's severed some of those traditional rivalries that we've seen. Whatever you want to talk about, if you want to talk about Nebraska, Colorado, if you want to talk about Oklahoma, Nebraska, there's been quite a few rivalries that have been changed, and I think you're going to see Oklahoma and Oklahoma State as a Bedlam matchup. Probably not going to happen for the near future, right? So I think it makes sense to go to 9. I think that just logically, in terms of what that scheduling should look like, you have your 3 non-conference games accompanied with the 9 conference games in that schedule.
J-Dub, it sounds like you're ready to unleash on this thing, so go to it.
Yeah, it's we were talking about this on my live show last night, and it's just, to me, it's the most asinine thing in the world for you to start thinking about. You're bringing in 2 big rivals in Texas and Oklahoma, which is fine, but we've talked about this a lot I think you and I have talked about it quite a bit over the last few weeks, that what makes college football go is rivalries. And you're about to cut this thing. You're about to cut half of them if you go to this 8-game schedule, half at least. And there's some that have 2 big rivals. So really, you're as many as 2/3 of the big rivalries in the sport, particularly in the league, are going to go by the wayside. That means you're not going to have Texas A&M and Texas again. I mean, they haven't played in 11 years. So they're not going to do that all the time. They're not going to be playing that every year. You won't have Tennessee, Alabama every year, but you'll have Tennessee and Vanderbilt every year. You're not going to have the oldest rivalry in the South, Auburn and Georgia, but you'll have Georgia and Florida every year. I think that not only is it bad to take away these rivalries, but it's also bad that you're looking at a situation where this is not going to have equity either. Mark, and I just feel like it's one of those things that I don't understand it. And it all comes down to the coaches and athletic directors. And you heard Nick Saban yesterday saying how it's most important thing is what the fans want. Well, I haven't heard a single creator in the SEC, and I watched a lot of them, that have said they want it to go to 8 games, and yet it's all about the fans. I just think that's BS.
All right. So we got a lot of things going here. I posted a video yesterday where basically I took what Sankey said about the 366 model or the 177 model and said, if I'm restricted to these 2 models, this is what I would do. These would be the 3 protected games for me for each team. Not easy to do. It's easy to say that team should have those 3 and that team should have those 3. But when you do the entire schedule, then you run into conflicts, of course. And then I went through the 177. Okay. Sankey mentioned bowl eligibility being a situation or an issue to look at. And when you look at it, the SEC plays 4 non-conference games right now with the 8 conference games. And most schools play 1 Power 5, and then they've got this smattering of pushover group of 5 in FCS. Some of them will play 2 Power 5s. But therefore, what you've got is you basically have the decision to either go to a 9-game schedule where, do the math, folks, it's easy. 14 games played within the conference is going to go 7-7. They're all playing each other if they play that additional conference game, as opposed to going out there and beating up a bunch of nobodies and going 14-0 or 13-1 with Vandy losing to Middle Tennessee. And it doesn't matter for bowl eligibility anyway, because they're 2-10. So basically, the conference is going to lose 6 to 7 wins per season spread throughout the conference that may take a bowl spot away from a Missouri or somebody not reaching a 6-win situation. So that was one consideration there that actually Sankey addressed and made a comment that he didn't think that it factored in too much, but it was something that they were looking at. Then you also have situation with the networks. I believe the networks are pushing in here a little bit to say, we need the best matchups. We need the best games. And so obviously the SEC and ESPN, they're tied at the hip now. That's all they've got is their ESPN contract. And so I'm sure ESPN is nudging this along to a certain extent and has some level of weight to say, we need this, and that. And now to both of your points, especially you, J-Dub, about the rivalries. Okay, I don't know why this is so difficult. For the last 30 years, the SEC has been split into 2 divisions, and for some reason, and I get it for the standpoint of uniformity, they have declared that there has to be a cross-division rival for everyone. Yes, Alabama and Tennessee, absolutely. It's a historic rivalry. It needs to be played. Auburn, Georgia, as Jason mentioned, the oldest rivalry in the South, has to be played. But the other ones were just placeholders. So it would restrict what they could do with the flexibility of the rest of the schedule. So my thought and recommendation from years gone by, and the same thing with the ACC, forcing teams like, in the SEC, Texas A&M and South Carolina to play every year. Why? You can protect those rivalries, but you don't have to have, everybody doesn't have to have the same number of placeholders. Meaning, this is what I would do. And the Big Ten's looking at this right now. The Big Ten's looking 3-6-6, 1-7-7, but they're looking at a third option, a flex schedule. So the flex schedule basically says not everybody's created equal. Georgia doesn't have the same number of rivals as Vandy, as does Texas and everyone else. Let's determine who the rivals are for each school that have to be played every year, and then build the rest of the schedule around that in a rotational way, so that the rest of the games get played and we make it as fair and equitable as possible. But I think you can protect a different number of rivals for each team. Why can't you do that?
I don't know. I mean, and I don't see a reason. I think it's kind of flexible as it is. I think it lends itself to that, because when they started talking about the 3-6-6 schedule to begin with, they were saying that they would likely probably do, well, they were going to go by the top half traditionally versus, or in the last 15 or 20 years, whatever it's been, versus the bottom half traditionally. The top half, you're going to go, 2 of your rivals have to be from the top half. The other one would be from the lower half. So, and vice versa on the lower end. Okay, that's flexible. And then if you wanted to make it to where in 10 years we're going to revisit this, or in 5 years, I don't care, whatever. But I think that, again, I think the main thing is I want it to be, first of all, equitable, and if you've got, like I said, Tennessee's playing Vandy, they're not going to play Alabama anymore. That just doesn't make sense to me. And literally, I think that they would choose, I was watching Allie Peak earlier, and she was talking about how it would definitely be the cocktail party for Florida and Georgia. And so you do lose Auburn and Georgia. That game's not going to happen anymore. The Iron Bowl stays in place. It should, but what happens to Georgia and Tennessee? What happens to Alabama, LSU? That's become a big rivalry in modern times right now. They've been playing every year because they're in the same division now. That's a hell of a game. Almost all the time, it's a hell of a game. And as fans, we're going to be – with all the changes going on in college football, there's a lot of people that I know feel disenfranchised from it. If this is the marquee program, take a step forward for Pete's sake and do something right. Do it for the fans. Make sure that week after week, the best games are being played. And that's, I mean, and every year. I don't see why it has to be, it's one thing. Yeah, I get it. Oklahoma's not going to get to play LSU every year, and it's probably not going to get to play Bama or Georgia. They've got their tie-ins already. But you've got a possibility of Florida. They've talked about that possibility. They've talked about A&M again. I'd love to see either one of those games, but I think the Florida game sounds fun. Go to the Swamp every other year and, build a new rivalry kind of like that. I feel like that's fun. The Arkansas one, I think, Falaby over here talking about that they hate OU. I think that they hate Texas more because of the old Southwest Conference days, and they've gotten to play them a few times in the last few years. But I do think that'd be another fun rivalry. A lot of people talk about Missouri. That could be your third one. That's fine. I don't really care one way or the other about Missouri, but a lot of people do. And I agree with Gerald on that one too, he started the complaint. We talked about this before. He started all that complaining about it with the 633. That, oh my gosh, we got to play, the rivals that they always play. They've played them every year, and he's complaining about it still. That I don't understand that one. And it's easy for us to say to end some of these rivalries, but if you're not in it, it's like somebody would say, "Oh, is it best to end OU in Texas?" What are you, out of your mind? You know what I mean? There's just no way. But that's the other one. Texas and Texas A&M aren't going to play every year. Jason, what do you think about that? I think that's nuts.
Yeah, so I take this from a little bit of a different angle. I'm a little bit of a conspiracy theorist from time to time. I think, when you think of an 8-game conference schedule versus a 9-game conference schedule, like Sankey has went on record in the current playoff format to state, expansion really isn't a big deal for us. Like we're in this each and every year. We've got one, sometimes two teams in the college football playoff. So part of me wonders if kind of the desire around this conference schedule, if it ends up being 8 consistently year in and year out, you have some of these teams that have an extra out of conference game, whether that be a mid-major team, whether that be a FCS opponent, a schedule where you look like you have 4 solid wins, whether, when you're taking away a conference game against a team that you sorry, I can't speak today. You may very well lose to. And so I wouldn't be surprised in the back of the decision-making mind here, is this an idea or a ploy to get more SEC teams in the expanded college football playoff? When you look at it from that perspective, hey, we don't want these teams beating up on each other. We want to get 3, maybe even 4 teams in this playoff each and every year. I mean, that's another thought process that I had, just kind of thinking of that.
I don't think there's any doubt that weighs heavily in the conversation, that thought process, and it's a bit.
You kind of saw it last season, right?
Yeah, there's not a formula. There's not a formula to it. It's not trying like the NFL in such a way that they would try to figure out what the schedule would need to be to get the most teams in the playoffs, any one division or conference, because it's not an objective system. It's a selection, but you can kind of try to position your teams in the best way, because that the schedules are going to be good enough. There's no way that they're not going to be good enough. So they could play 7 conference games and their schedules are still going to be tough enough that the committee is not going to look down on any SEC schedule. So why not have the best records for our teams to try to fit in as many playoff teams as possible?
I still feel like you're going to have enough of those teams that not every team in the SEC is it's not murderer's row from top to bottom. It's just not. So, I mean, somebody, and I love the podcast, but the SEC podcast was talking yesterday or a couple of days ago, maybe about Missouri being one of the top teams. Well, that's because the East is trash, but they're not going to beat Georgia. I mean, come on. But traditionally, these guys are not going to get that much better. I can't even imagine it, and Vanderbilt. Come on, man. Vanderbilt.
Well,
And
somebody said
again, and I
oh,
think that
Vanderbilt.
Oklahoma and Texas may struggle going in. I don't think it's just as easy as walking in there and all of a sudden you're going to win the conference.
So I'm
You
not
know,
understanding the point. To me, the SEC is a murderer's row. That doesn't mean everybody's a national championship contender. Of
it
course they're
is.
not. But I mean, in comparison to other conference schedules, just pull up Auburn's schedule,
Right.
for example.
Oh yeah.
That if today we decided that Auburn or Texas A&M or somebody that's not considered a contender in the SEC, you moved them to the ACC, I think I'm not going to say that they're going to play in the ACC championship game, but I'm going to say I wouldn't be surprised if
Right. No, and I'm not saying that they're not good from top to, but I mean, there's some schools that are going to traditionally struggle, even when they're, you think they might be pretty good. Arkansas last year, once they lost that Texas A&M game, they went the other way. And
well, somebody's got to lose the games.
I agree with that part of it too, and I think that, but that's what I'm saying. I do think that it's good from. I guess I misspoke. It is good from top to bottom, but it's not. Not every one of those teams is going to win the national championship. I don't see that somebody does have to lose, and every year you do have somebody that finishes with no more than one loss. And you generally have a couple more that don't have any more than one loss too, because they generally have two teams in the playoff almost every year now. Last year was one of those years that they didn't. So, and it worked out for Ohio State that they got to sit home, because had they have had to it worked out for them because of, the way it all, SC losing, and even, obviously LSU losing that last game before they went to the championship game. It hurt them. Again, I still feel like if you throw Bama into there, they would have beaten any of those other teams. I do think that. So that being said, though, I think as the best conference in the country, why are you not stepping forward? Why are you not stepping forward and let's continue playing these games? I want to see them play the best games. Nick Saban was talking about, if you do this and do 9 games, then we got to take away these out of conference games with Power 5 teams that we've scheduled for the next 10 years. Why? You can't take away the Citadel? You can't take away Tennessee State? Why?
Yeah, that I don't agree with. There are already 9 conference games being played in other conferences.
Right.
Do you have to play 3 cream puffs?
Yeah. And particularly right at the end of the year when everybody's vying for a playoff position, there's always that right towards the end of the season, they play cream puff you.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, I agree that those games aren't the best positioned games, but if overall your
I don't want to
schedule's
see them play it.
more difficult, then I understand the justification for playing those games, meaning that just because they're playing them in week 11 and not playing them in week 2, what's the difference? You don't like that they're positioned late in
I don't
the
like
season,
them.
or you
I
don't?
don't like them that they're playing it. I don't want to see them play that team. I mean, that a team right there. Look, if you're
Every other conference is playing those games too. They're just playing them earlier.
okay, yeah, okay. But I mean, either way, I agree with you. I guess to me, I guess I don't really like it that it's right at the end of the season when everybody's, you're looking for
Yeah,
that.
I
That
get
seems
that.
to me like it's a break game, and it's everybody else is kind of playing into their conference schedule. You don't see that really happening in any other conference.
I
So
think
it's
both
just
can be true. I think that there can be a valid concern and argument that there should be uniformity, and that other conferences have 9 conference games. Therefore, the SEC, especially once you expand. So that's the other thing, is the math of the more you expand and don't expand your conference schedule, then you're not playing a large portion of the team. So you're talking about an 8-game schedule with 15 other teams. You're missing 7 teams a year that you're not playing in your conference. So that starts to become a more serious issue.
Mhm.
Um, It's the complete opposite of what we're experiencing and have in the Big 12, where everybody plays everyone, and it's the most legitimate championship. On the other hand, I understand the SEC argument that we've got the best conference. It's not debatable. So whether we play 8 conference games or
definitely not
9
debatable.
conference games, we're playing 8 tougher games than your 9 games.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, Mark. I mean, and I think, at some point, I think all three of us and probably a lot of people watching this and listening to this agree that at some point, these teams, this Power Five is going to break away from the NCAA, right? I mean, it's not, I don't think it's a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And so when you get to that point, I mean, Mark, to your point about fair and equal scheduling, I mean, that's going to happen at some point, right? Especially when the dust settles on all of this realignment talk. So I think that, but yeah, there's a bit of an unfair advantage, I guess you would say, in certain situations where they don't have to play the whether you want to call it the murderer's row or what that scheduling looks like from the SEC. And I don't know. I mean, I think back to the point that we were talking about, you guys were talking about a few minutes ago in relation to, okay, if we go to nine teams, then we're gonna release some of these Power Five matchups. I mean, I don't think as true football fans, college football fans, nobody wants to watch Alabama play the Citadel, right? But I think it's a necessary evil in some instances. Like, these games completely fund these FCS teams for an entire year. So
I'll give you that one.
Yeah,
I understand.
And that's why I mean that's just a necessary evil. Yes, I mean how often? Once every 20 years you're going to see an Appalachian State over Michigan type of situation, maybe once every 25, 30 years. But those games largely are typically non-competitive. So I think the perception, I mean, Jason, you mentioned, I think the perception is it is a little bit of a break for the SEC in terms of having it being later in the year. Yes, Mark, you're right. It doesn't matter whether it's game 1 or whether it's game 10, but I think the perception is, okay, this team needs a little bit of a break from the murderer's row, the tougher schedule, and so I think they're strategically putting those games there. At least they have historically.
So I'm not saying it doesn't matter. I'm saying, yes, you're right. I am saying when you look at the schedule in its entirety, it doesn't matter where they're placed, but you can make an argument that, and I don't have an issue with the SEC protecting its own interests. There's no governing body to say this is the way it needs to be done in every conference. You can't do that. We're not allowing it. The SEC is going to do whatever they're going to do. Right. And they're basically, and it's not like they're going out playing top teams from the other conferences. Well, you know what? I'll take that back. They are playing.
Sometimes they are. Yeah.
Florida State, Georgia Tech, Louisville, Kentucky, and South Carolina, Clemson play.
Those are also at risk, though. I mean, there's talking about those being at risk as well.
No, but the point I'm making is that they are going out some of those teams. So I have no issue with Auburn and Alabama are playing the last game of the season, and they both go play a cream puff the week before. Well, nobody gets the advantage there. They both play a cream puff to prepare for that game. But Georgia playing a cream puff before Georgia Tech, South Carolina playing a cream puff before Clemson. Well, that's an unfair advantage over a team from another conference that's playing its conference schedule all the way through and a legitimate opponent the week before that game.
And I just feel that's the other part is that every other conference, aside from the ACC, of course, but I think that they would probably move to their 9 games as well if you saw the SEC do it, and it just, but the rest of the conferences are playing 9 games. And that's, I think if you do break away or whatever, are you going to start having some of these things? But I think the main thing with me is I just don't want to see more of these traditional rivalries going away. And I think if you go with this schedule and you've got one permanent rival, you're at minimum cutting it in half, because I mean, I think pretty much every team in the SEC has 2 rivals, and maybe not Missouri. I mean, some of them are, as you said, Jason, kind of, built a rivalry or something like with the A&M and LSU, but that's gotten pretty, it's been very contentious. It's been a good game to watch. So, Arkansas and LSU, I think that's another one that they kind of built up. That being said, I think that these games have become important to those teams. They're playing for something. But when you start talking about the real rivalries that are old, that's not good. I don't want to see. I mean, what happens with South Carolina, Georgia, South Carolina, Florida, some of these other ones? They're just going to go by the wayside.